Hello and welcome to Tales for Life. In each episode of this podcast, we'll explore a folk or fairy tale from a different culture or region and discover the life lessons, values, and morals they offer that we can use today. Join me on the journey through the magical and meaningful world of folk and fairy tales. Thanks for joining me for another episode of the Tales for Life podcast, the podcast that journeys through life one tale at a time. Today we're going to take a short journey down the road of self-reflection and perhaps a little bit of ethics in an episode I've decided to call None of Us Are Perfect. One of the hardest things in the world for us to do is look at ourselves honestly. We probably look at ourselves more often in a negative light than anything else, but there are times when we also look down our noses at others and think how much better we are than someone else. In fact, given the presence of tabloid newspapers, it seems we often thrive on it. There is a saying often attributed to Buddha that we should place no head above our own. While Buddha never actually said this, there is a lot of truth to it. We tend to look at famous people, beautiful people, or rich people as something special and think whatever they do or say is so much more important or wiser than what we do or say. And, not surprisingly, these same people tend to believe, or at least act as if they believe, that they really are better than anyone else. But they would do well, like us, to remember that the truth of no head above your own goes both ways. One shouldn't place their own head above another's either. One of the best stories to help emphasize this point is a short but ingenious tale from Korea involving someone who has committed a crime. The story is titled, appropriately enough, The Clever Thief. Many years ago in Korea, there was a clever thief. He was so clever that he had never been caught by the police and had thus grown very rich. As he aged, however, he grew overconfident and careless, and one morning he was apprehended while stealing a small amount of spices from a shopkeeper. With great satisfaction, the police brought the thief before an extremely severe judge, who fined the old man very heavily. Unable to pay the sum, the thief had to submit instead to a very lengthy jail sentence. For a year he tried to escape the prison, but with no success. He grew thoughtful, and at first regretted his carelessness. Then he thought of all the people of his country he had known who had grown rich and powerful, and were not in prison. This gave him one last idea to escape, and he vowed to himself that if he did, he would become an honest man for the remainder of his years. The next morning, he called the jailer and said that he would like to see the king. The jailer laughed at him and asked why the king would want to see him. "I have a gift for him," the thief said. "It is an extraordinary one." The jailer looked at the thief. He did not believe him in truth, but he knew that if this thief did indeed have a gift for the king and he did not present him, it would not go well with him. With some reluctance, he went to arrange the meeting. Some days later, the thief was brought out of prison and taken to the palace. The king sat on his throne surrounded by his aides and generals. He looked sternly at the thief. "What is it you want?" demanded the king. "I have a most extraordinary gift for you," the thief said with a bow. "I warn you, thief, that if you are wasting my time, it will be more than prison as your punishment." Undeterred, the thief reached a hand into his pocket and pulled out a tiny box. It was elegantly wrapped in gold paper. With a bow, he presented it to the king. The king opened the box. Then he stared angrily at the thief. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded in a loud voice. "How dare you waste my time with an ordinary plum pit?" "My king," the thief said calmly, "this is truly a plum pit, but it is no ordinary one. The one who plants this plum pit will reap nothing but golden plums." There was a moment of stunned silence, and then the king's eyes narrowed. "If this is so," began the king, "then why have you not planted it yourself?" "For a very good reason," the thief said sadly. "Only people who have never stolen or cheated another may reap the benefit. For all others, this will only produce a normal plum tree. And that is why, Your Majesty, I have brought it to you." The king was silent for a long time before sadly shaking his head. He was an honest man, but there had been a time when he was a young boy and had stolen some pennies from his mother's purse. "Alas," said the king, "I am not the right person to plant this." "Well, how about the Prime Minister?" suggested the thief. "Perhaps he—" But the old thief got no further with his sentence. "Impossible!" blustered the Prime Minister with a very red face. He had often accepted bribes from people who wanted fine positions within the government. Surely the pit would never work for him. "You then, General?" asked the thief, turning to the head of the army. No, muttered the general with lowered eyes. He had become an enormously rich man by cheating his soldiers of part of their pay. "Well then, Mr. Secretary of State," offered the thief. "I'm afraid not," sputtered the honorable old man, whose conscience was obviously troubling him. Like the Prime Minister, he had at times accepted money in return for favors. "Then the head jailkeeper must be our man," said the thief solemnly as he turned to the last candidate. Silently, the jailkeeper shook his head and shrugged his shoulders. "I'm afraid I'm not right either," he said at last. He was remembering how he was always treating new prisoners, sending those who gave him money to the best quarters and reserving the worst cells for the poor and unfortunate. Refusing to give up, the thief suggested several other officials. Each of the fine gentlemen, however, rejected in his turn the offer of the plum pit that would bear him golden fruit forever. When the room was entirely still, each official trying to hide his embarrassment, the old thief suddenly burst out laughing. "You gentlemen," he exclaimed, "you embezzle and you steal, and yet you never end up in jail." He searched their faces earnestly, and then in a quiet voice he added, "I have done nothing more than steal some spices, and for this I have been condemned to serve 5 years in jail." For quite some time the king and his officials remained silent with shame. At last the king stirred. "I would suggest," he said in a low voice, looking at each of his ministers one by one, "that we all contribute to this man's fine so that he will not go back to jail." Immediately the necessary money was gathered and placed at the monarch's feet. Calling the old thief to him, the king gave him the money. "Go, my good man," he said. "You are free. You have spent enough time in prison. From your experience, you have instructed us wisely. Ministers and kings sometimes forget themselves. We will remember your lesson well." The thief bowed in thanks to the king and left the palace a free man. He returned home and set about to fulfill the promise to himself to live an honest life. It's a simple tale with a simple message, but it seems to be a message that often gets forgotten. Without dragging this out, let me conclude with just a few words. First and foremost, there are no innocent parties in this tale, just as there are no pure people in life. We've all made mistakes or done things that we likely shouldn't have done. This doesn't make us terrible people, extreme cases aside, of course. it just makes us human. This is not a story about good versus bad, but a story about people, about us. Which leads us to the most important part of this story, or parts. Part 1, because we're not perfect, we're not really in the position to look down our nose at someone else's imperfections. We're not better than anyone else because we didn't do something as bad as they did. And who's to say that if the full truth were known, the bad action we're calling out might actually be less than some of the things we've done? And part 2, we're all better people living in a better world when we recognize that we're all equally bad and equally good. Because once we stop being snobbish about how good we are compared to how bad someone else is, we can focus on actually doing good, which is the lesson the thief teaches the king, his ministers, himself, and us. We can't achieve perfection and can't knock anyone else for not achieving it either, but we can be good, and that's all we need to be.